Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Illustration Department podcast. My name is Giuseppe Castellano. In this podcast, I talk to folks in illustration, graphic design, publishing, animation, and other creative fields about their work, the lessons they've learned, and the bumps and bruises they've experienced along the way. In this episode, my guest is Skylar Smith, professor of liberal arts at the Ringling College of Art and Design. Illustration history isn't just about art in the past. As Skylar and I discuss, it represents change, advancements in technology, and answers to present-day questions. Among other topics, Skylar and I talk about why there's no time like the present to start learning about the history of illustration. We debate whether an illustration is fully complete without the interpretation of an audience. And Skylar shares what generative AI and a lawsuit by Albrecht Dürer have in common. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
I'm a little bit nervous, but I think once we get going, I'll loosen up a little.
Well, here's the secret. I think I might have mentioned this occasionally on the podcast over the years. I don't remember. I'm sort of hopped up on cold medicine, so my brain is a little mushy this week. I'm nervous before every recording. I'm nervous right now. I'm serious.
That's really reassuring, and because I'm the same way before I teach. It took a full year to not sweat through all of my clothes.
I've definitely been there. My first handful, maybe first dozen presentations I did over the years at schools, including Ringling and conferences and things. Yeah, sweating. Armpit sweating. It was bad.
The trick is layers. Lots of layers.
Dark clothes.
No one needs to know.
Dark clothes. Or is it light clothing that hides sweat? It's dark clothing, right?
Dark clothing.
Yeah.
Black is your friend.
Black is your friend. Yeah, you know, I don't know. Maybe the nerves is just a sign that we want to do a good job.
Well, I think it's Brene Brown in Atlas of the Heart breaks down emotions into different categories. Mm-hmm. And nervous and excitement are in the same bucket. It's just how you approach it.
Good to know. I like that. I'll hold on to that. I'm just a nervous person generally anyways. I'm always nervous about everything.
Same.
We know we don't need to unpack that today. It's not therapy hour. It's illustration hour. So in our correspondence, you said something that I thought was really interesting. You said you listened to the podcast as a way to help understand what your students at the Ringling School of College, Ringling College of Art and Design. ARCAD. So yeah, that, you know, your students should know about history to better prepare them as practitioners. So first, thanks. That's a nice ego boost for me. Needed that. Second, what did you mean?
Honestly, my thanks are to you because it's been an incredible resource for me.
Nice.
Art historians are trained in a very particular way, but most people at Ringling that are taking my classes are going to be practitioners, not historians.
Right.
So I didn't want to teach it like a typical art history course where tradition dictates image IDs, short essays, that sort of thing. And I listened to your podcast to understand what art directors are looking for, what publishers are looking for, so that they could shape not only the work that they're creating, but how they approach a project and how they talk about it in a way that benefits them in the long run.
Well, that's nice to hear. It is. Sometimes, so it is. It's like apparently it's honest hour now. I, in addition to being nervous all the time, do sometimes think that, like, when an episode goes out, especially when it's an episode with somebody like Jules Feiffer, I think to myself, because I'm a human with a little bit of an ego, like, wow, this is a good episode. It's Jules Feiffer. It's going to get a lot of, responses or likes or whatever, shares or whatever. And then it doesn't. If I'm being human and I'm being honest, and I'm just going to share this with you guys, the listener, and you, Skylar, I'm thinking, like, did anyone listen to it? Did it make any difference?
I think that's a very human thing. both to want to see the thing that you put your time and energy into developing want to succeed out in the world.
Right.
And then also to feel like you're kind of shouting into a void sometimes.
Sometimes. And I know it's not real. I do. I don't want people listening to this thinking like I'm begging for them to email me and be like, no, man, it's great. Because I do get those. I do. But every now and then it feels weird. It feels weird that you put so much work into something. In this case, it's an episode, but it can be an illustration. It can be a lesson plan. It can be like whatever. You put all this work into something and then you put it out. You share it with someone. You share it with your students or with listeners of a podcast episode or whatever. And then it's just sort of nothing. Silence. It's weird. It's a weird feeling.
But I think it's also kind of the nature of teaching. And I think of your podcast as a natural extension of teaching because you're sharing information for other people to use. You don't always see the ramifications up front. Sometimes what you say or a reading that you assign or a conversation that you have takes a good 10 years to sink in for someone.
Yeah, good point. All right. I think I've drawn enough compliments out of you for me to last for a couple of days. Until the next episode recording. No, I'm kidding. There's another thing I've been thinking about. I had a question for you, which I'll share, but it sort of got me thinking about it myself and how I would answer this. It's this question, why is illustration history important? Mm-hmm. Right? And like the obvious answer is, well, history is important as we can learn from the past to pave a better way for the future. Great. That's true and nice, and it works. And that's the answer. For me, though, it's a little more than that. I think it's like, well, it's giving respect to illustrators who deserve it. Maybe these illustrators didn't get that respect when they were alive, especially women and people of color throughout history. It's being curious about other members of this very special club that we're a part of, like honoring our elders kind of thing.
Absolutely.
So how do you see it?
That is something that I typically talk about the first day in my history of illustration courses.
Okay.
Because
Let me
again,
get my notebook out and start taking some notes. Go ahead. Go ahead, teach.
There will be a test at the end.
Oh, God. Anxiety levels just spiked. Thanks.
You're in a safe space, Giuseppe. No worries. But some of my favorite students are the ones who come in and they're like, I'm a practitioner. I don't have any interest in history. I just want to learn software and be great. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I get a lot of those day one, and that's okay. Those are my favorite students because it's a challenge and a promise that somebody that I bring up or some art piece that I show over the duration of this semester is going to make your eyes light up.
Exactly.
It's going to happen.
Exactly.
I love history for multiple reasons. It lets me understand how and why things are the way they are today so that we can do our due diligence as stewards of the present to make the future better. Mm-hmm. But it's also a Rolodex that creative artists can tap into. Like I try to cover about 150 artists in the semester. So a lot of creativity, you don't know what you don't know. So that when you see a variety of styles across time and culture, you know that exists and you can incorporate it into your own practice.
Right.
And the same goes for individuals. Like I take what I call a Canon Plus approach in those classes, where of course we're going to talk about Norman Rockwell and George Petty, mm-hmm. but we're also going to talk about Miné Okubo and Arthur Szyk because mm-hmm. they're equally important.
Yeah.
And then you can look at illustration as a history of change because it's largely intertwined with advancements in technology, for better or worse. So somebody like J.C. Leyendecker was able to keep his style consistent throughout his career, whereas Al Parker was changing every 5 seconds.
Right.
And Saul Tepper was changing industries every 5 seconds.
Right. Yeah.
There's no right or wrong way to do it, but understanding how other artists have had to adapt in the past is precedent and I hope comforting to artists who are going to have to continue to face technological changes throughout their own careers now.
Right. One of the main things I like to share is how difficult it was for them in some respect, whatever they were doing. For example, I talk to a lot of illustrators who deal with a lot of rejection. And so I immediately go to the Norman Bridwells, the Beatrix Potters, Todd McFarlane got rejected 350 times. The more we know about this, the better we feel about being rejected ourselves. So that's just one example.
Absolutely. That's totally a part of the way things are built in, because when I bring up golden age artists in class, I see a lot of wide eyes because everybody immediately feels behind because James Montgomery Flagg was publishing for life when he was 14.
Oh, good Lord.
There are no child labor laws. But then you have somebody like Seymour Chwast that didn't really make it big until he was about 40.
Yeah, podcast guest.
Yes, he was.
Yes, he was. He was awesome, by the way. Being in his apartment was huge and great, and just north of Union Square in Manhattan, typical New York lofty kind of space. And I'm sitting at the dining room table with Seymour Chwast. It was a little mind-blowing.
Oh, absolutely. I had to send him an email in a previous job, and I was so starstruck from just sending him an email. Yeah. Sometimes especially when I'm inviting illustrators like a Jules Feiffer or a Hilary Knight or Ashley Bryan or someone who's been around a long time, living legends. I mean, Ashley Bryan passed very recently, but you know what I mean? It just in the middle of drafting that email, I do think to myself, like, I'm emailing Jules Feiffer. It doesn't compute, but okay, whatever, hit send, and then they respond back, and then, then you're off and running, which is pretty great. The other thing I really like about studying illustration history is you find kindred spirits. Like, absolutely.
If Tomi Ungerer was around today, I was able to talk to him, I think we'd be pals. I really do think we'd be pals.
I love that.
Yeah. I'd want that to be true. Maybe not. Maybe he'd hate me. Who knows? But he had his struggles too, right? I mean, he got blacklisted and basically booted out of this country for illustrating an adult book on, sexualized themes, let's say. And that's something that I'd want to talk to him about and how he processed that. I mean, you know what I mean? So there's all these, what's that question people ask you? Who would you want to have dinner with? People say, oh, Hemingway and whoever. No, man, give me Flagg, give me Leyendecker. Although Flagg, I think, was a little bit of a jerk, which is my understanding. I think he was a little bit of a womanizer.
I think he was very much a man about town for his
era. There you go. Man about town. Much more professional way of saying it. Yeah. Nice.
But I love that connection because I feel like history at its worst just gets reduced to names and dates and facts that you have to memorize.
Right.
But it's when you toggle between the macro and the micro and ground it in an individual that it really starts to be magical and compelling.
Right, exactly. Another good example I love is Massimo Vignelli, who's not an illustrator, he's a designer. When he designed the New York subway map, it's a perfect piece of art. But many decades later, he kind of admitted there was one flaw, and the flaw was the New Yorker. New Yorkers couldn't quite align the geography of New York with his map. And he's like, so yeah, I mean, they didn't get it, but other than that, it's perfect. And that just ties into like what illustrator, designer working for any advertiser or any kind of client has had that experience where you did a good job. I mean, that sucker is great. And then the client or somebody else who's maybe not artistically inclined comes back with, yeah, it's not that great. I don't, it doesn't work for me. And you're like, oh my God, please see my genius, that sort of thing.
It's just a reminder that we're all human and it's all relative.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I think just one last note on this is personally, and fair warning, I guess we are going into therapy hour a little bit. Personally, it's tied to how angry I am that my own past was taken from me by a couple of years of depression. Like while I was depressed, my memory card in my brain ceased to function. So I have very few memories of that time. And it's like a black hole, kind of like it's a lost time. And this is when my kids were younger. So when I think about that time and I think about it like losing all of those memories and losing all of those experiences, I get really enraged.
That makes total sense.
Right. So I'm helping other illustrators' pasts, like I'm helping bring light to other illustrators' pasts, maybe in a way to somehow fill that hole in myself. I need to talk to the therapist about this. All right. End of therapy hour. Yeah, sorry.
All good.
So speaking of therapy, how long have you been teaching at Ringling?
This is the spring semester of my 4th year here.
Okay. What's your role there?
I'm a professor, so I teach classes in history of illustration, women and race in illustration, posters and propaganda, visual culture and American advertising, and occasionally writing for digital media.
So we don't have a lot of time to cover every single thing from every single one of those courses. What would be the main, not takeaway? What is it that you're trying to communicate? What is it that you're hoping your students and the listeners of this episode get out of what you teach?
I'm hoping that they understand that they are a part of history. Like, I feel like history often gets categorized with like a capital H, and history started 30 years ago.
Right.
And anytime between then and now is just present, and we're just doing our best. But
Yep.
All history is stuff happening to people, and we're all people, and stuff happens to us.
Nice.
So, like, there are larger overarching things like race and gender and politics and the rules of social propriety that are questions that we haven't solved yet. We're still figuring it out. But when you read a book about contemporary American culture, it's very different than The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those where the day-to-day may not seem very different, but when you take a step back, 4 years ago is very different than 40 years ago. And right. How do we follow those larger threads and understand them now in order to shape them in the future?
Where People and Stuff Happens. Was that the title of your thesis?
Which thesis?
PCs?
No. One was over propaganda posters from World War I, and one was over a cartoon series by Tex Avery.
Do you see things repeating over the years as you've studied propaganda? As you know, it isn't just illustration history, but it's design history. It's propagandistic history. Is that even a thing? You know, it's like the history of the printed piece, whatever that printed thing is, whether it's a book, a poster, for whatever reason, for whatever type of client, the government, publishers, whatever. Do you see any repetition throughout history?
Oh, absolutely. There's always patterns, and there's always things that persist throughout history up to now. The one that gives me the most solace when I think about AI in relation to illustration is that from literally prehistory, before the written word, people were drawing things. They wanted to communicate with other people and to tell stories and share images. Now, the technology and rate at which people have shared things or circulated things have changed drastically across time, cultures, countries. Mm-hmm. But it's still such a human thing to want to tell a story and make a picture about it.
We're going to get to AI later. This podcast is produced by the Illustration Department, a global leader in online education for illustrators. Visit illustrationdept.com for offerings like mentorships and portfolio reviews, testimonials, our alumni showcase, our best-selling Substack, and more. That's illustrationdept.com. And now, back to our conversation. I was barely aware of the existence of the International Society of Appraisers until I started doing research for you and this episode. The International Society of Appraisers. I bet your annual conferences are raging kegers.
That I can't speak to. I'm very much on the baby praiser end.
Baby praiser, nice.
Baby praiser.
Like
just getting my feet wet.
Okay.
But I'm a deeply curious person, and I like to look at things from all different angles. So like I've been an artist, I've been a curator, I've done exhibition reviews, I've been a researcher, I've been a teacher. But in a funny roundabout sort of way, you never learn the monetary value of things in art history courses.
Right.
Or trace how those change over time. And I figured that would be a really cool element to fold into classes eventually, and to get my hand back into touching things, because I love old stuff and I love to look at it up close.
Ditto. I mean, what is this group? I need to look more into it, man, because it's, and what is the initiation process? Like, to be part of, is there some sort of like clandestine paganistic ritual that you're supposed to be a part? I'm just asking for a friend.
I haven't had anybody show up at my door and drag me out my PJs to Waffle House just yet.
All right.
But it's always a chance.
It's coming.
Basically, there are 3 different bodies. The American Association of Appraisers, I believe, is one. I might be butchering their initials. Okay. The International Society of Appraisers, and there's one other one that is largely about real estate appraisals. Basically, anybody, say your grandfather owned an antique store and you know that business inside and out, you can give really good valuations of things. If you're newer to the field like me, it's good to go with a membership, because there's coursework that you can take and a board of ethics that you accept, or a set of ethics that you accept.
Right.
Because it can get kind of dicey. Like if you are appraising a painting and you are charging 10% of the value of that painting as your commission for doing the appraisal work, you're way more likely to assign a high number that may not be real. So the ethics just kind of keeps you honest and make sure that you're doing your clients and yourself due diligence.
Sure. Let's say I have a piece, an illustration, and I reach out to you and say, hey, would you mind giving this an appraisal? And you do. That 10%, right? Let's say you appraise it at $10,000. If I'm doing the math correctly, that would be for you $1,000. But you don't get the $1,000 unless I sell it for $10,000, right? Or do I just pay you $1,000 and trust that your appraisal is correct?
Well, the code of ethics says that I couldn't charge you that way, because it makes it more likely for me to inflate those numbers. The first thing I would ask is, what is this appraisal for? Is it for a tax write-off? Is it for, like, if you're donating it to a museum? Is it for insurance purposes? Are you trying to sell it?
Trying to pay for my kids' college tuition?
Very fair.
I wouldn't mind a nice pair of sneakers. I mean, that sort of thing.
So then you go into, for my fee, I would figure out a flat fee or how to charge you effectively. I have not started this work. I got delayed by teaching extra classes in a series of hurricanes, the joys of Florida.
Yeah.
So I'm still a textbook baby appraiser, but I would charge a flat fee up front, or let you know how much an hourly fee would be to do that work. And then I would go into auction records or sites where art has changed hands, and you have to do what's called comparables. So it's like, this piece by Eric Carle from that same book sold for X amount of dollars 6 months ago. And then you find multiple examples to kind of give an informed opinion as to what that piece would be worth in a magic world where you are not under any pressure to sell it and nobody is under any pressure to buy it other than they want it.
I don't know. This could be just the mafia in me talking a little bit, but what is stopping an appraiser from seeing a piece, knowing that it's insanely valuable, and it's from an illustrator that, the general public doesn't really know about? Let's say, I don't know, George Herriman, people know about, but let's say it's George Herriman. And then the appraiser's like, oh my God, it's George Herriman. So then the appraiser says, that's not worth much. I don't know, $500. Tell you what, though, I'll buy it off of you. And then the appraiser goes off and sells it for, $50,000 or whatever. Is that a thing? I'm not in the mafia, by the way.
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah. I don't
And I'm not going to ask any follow-up questions.
All I'm saying is Paul Castellano, who got shot down in Brooklyn, is he my uncle? I'm not going to answer that.
Again, no further questions, Giuseppe.
All right. I like how you said my name. Like, I'm just going to properly pronounce your name, showing respect. Where am I going with that? I have no idea where I'm going with that. Okay, let's come back to like being serious in art. So like, what's stopping somebody from doing that?
That's why I joined the International Society of Appraisers, because their code of ethics is so strong. And if you do something like that, you get kicked out.
And that's all? You just get kicked out? Or, I mean, is there...
It brings up larger questions of fraud, and could somebody sue you for doing that because you evaluated at this price point and then sold it for that, knowing full well what it was really worth?
Yeah.
There's a lot of legal recourse for things like that. So you really have to do your homework and be very careful.
I assume, there are all sorts of clientele. I would assume museums is the most obvious one. Galleries, I suppose. Or is it more just individuals coming to you or someone like you and saying, I have a painting in my attic from my, great uncle. He was an illustrator. Take a look at it.
It can be a complete range. Here in Florida, there's also an older population here. So it's a law that before any sort of caregiver moves into somebody's home, there has to be a formal inventory done of everything in the house. So if something disappears,
Wow.
They know it was there before.
Right.
So there's the day-to-day uses. Like if you are strong collector, you're going to want to have insurance policies on all of those paintings in case anything happens. So it just really runs a gamut. A lot of auction houses use them as a way to help estimate prices, and museums use them for insurance purposes and to make acquisitions at a reasonable rate as well.
Yeah. What led you to illustration?
Very roundabout. I started in studio art, and I love to create, but it was really stressing me out at the prospect of that being my future. Like, it's the thing I do to relax.
Right.
So I didn't really want to proceed down that route, but I took an art history class and I absolutely fell in love. I love the visual grounding as a way to start exploring history. Mm-hmm. And then again, I love context. So I also did a dual focus major in English and then minors in religious studies and history. Yep. But I got to illustration because I'm just a normal schmo from Oklahoma. I'm not from a particularly wealthy or fancy group of people. They're extremely kind, and I'm very fond of them. But I wanted to know what normal people were looking at. And that's what led me to illustration. It's like, sure, this chalice is dipped in gold and has rubies, and that's beautiful, but like, what do normal people hang on their wall?
And now I'm thinking of Indiana Jones. You said chalice. Be sure to pick the right one.
Every art historian is secretly a little bit Indiana Jones in the background.
That's badass as hell. Yeah, normal schmoes are my favorite schmoes. I like normal schmoes. In terms of going back to a little bit to teaching art history, I've mentioned this from time to time in the podcast, and jokingly, 90% of this is jokingly, but a little bit isn't.
That leaves 10%, Giuseppe.
Yeah, I know. I can do math a little bit, just a little bit. The this idea that you're how do I frame this? This idea that an art historian professor will have some piece up on the screen, whether it's a chalice or a painting or a fresco, or illustration, whatever it is, and they'll speak to the intentions of the artist. Mm-hmm. As in, of course, Giotto intentionally meant for this to happen. This design looks like this because he intentionally meant for it to look like this. And specifically, when it comes to like maybe color theory or composition or shapes or whatever it is, when it comes to sort of the construction of that piece, then yeah, that makes sense. But when it comes to like what they were feeling or like maybe the messaging, particularly when it's something a little bit more abstract, there's a part of me that just sits there and goes like, you don't know that.
Same.
Okay. So what kind of art historian teacher are you? I mean, sounds like you don't do that.
Not particularly,
Okay.
unless there's like a letter or a record in the archive that says specifically what they were thinking. I don't try to divine the thoughts of the illustrators who came before me.
Yeah. I had an art history teacher who did that, and she's tainted my view of art history teachers.
Oh no.
You're helping erase the damage. You are. But yeah, she did a lot of that. She, especially with compositions, she'd draw, she'd point lines like, oh, look at this line going this way and that line going that way. Obviously, the artist intentionally meant for that, the tippy top of this guy's head lining perfectly. If you draw a line from there to the window on the other side of the painting, it proves obviously that Caravaggio meant for that line to be there. And I think you're full of shit.
Same. And I think that comes from being the practitioner yourself or the maker, because I view myself mainly as an armchair illustrator. I did the Sketchatorian series with the Norman Rockwell Museum where I drew, but most of the time it's just for me.
Right.
But I know that I sit there and giggle and go, well, this line would be funny, or what happens if I put it there instead?
Exactly. And this is me, again, this is now me going back to silly. The Mona Lisa would be a good example of this. How everyone is ad nauseum has sort of come to conclusions as to what Leonardo meant to do, and it was a self-portrait or it isn't, and it's him in drag or it's not, and what she was thinking and who she is. Sometimes I just wonder, and I'm sure I'm wrong, there's 1% chance that maybe I'm not, that maybe I'm right, that it's just a portrait. That's all it is. It's nothing more than that.
But then the cultural historian in me comes out, and I'm saying, what does it matter what the artist thought? I'm more interested in how it was received and how that reception has changed over time.
Interesting. And that speaks to, is an illustration, let's just stick to illustration, but I think this can apply to any visual art, excluding chalices. Let's just stick to paintings, frescoes, illustrations. Does the illustration need the audience? Can an illustration live on its own without the interpretation?
Of course it can. But my question is, what is the purpose for that piece? Is it for the artist? Is it to just make it as an exercise in technique? Or is it an editorial cartoon for the New Yorker that's supposed to make people giggle or maybe think about politics in a different way?
Right. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, does the viewer complete the illustration? Does the illustration say to the viewer, you complete me?
I think so.
Interesting. I have to think more about this.
Yeah. What's your take on that?
I don't think that was the right way of phrasing that question. I had to think more about it. I don't know. I think that it's a symbiotic relationship. And I think without the viewer, the illustration is incomplete. I think maybe tonight or tomorrow I'll change my mind. I'm not sure. I have to think more about this.
It's making me think this class is from 14 years ago, so take my memory with a grain of salt here. But I think there's a theory in sociology called a Weberian circle, where you as a person puts an artwork out into the world, and the world interacts with that art piece, changes it, interprets it, and then gives that information back to you. So it's a constant cycle of change and interaction.
That's what I'm trying to tap into. That's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
So yes, I do believe that that's a thing.
I didn't know it had a name. Interesting. Turning our attention from interesting things to things that annoy the hell out of me. What are your students? Your students don't annoy me. AI does. What are your students saying about AI, if anything?
A lot of them are nervous about AI, very understandably so. I understand that on a practical level, and I also feel that in my little historian heart, where I'm much more comfortable with things that happened 100 years ago, because you have the beauty of retrospect and distance,
right,
to know if those changes are good or bad, or at least how they've changed things. Most students tend to dislike AI in the thing that they love. So if they're an illustration major, they hate AI for image creating purposes. If they're a creative writing major, they hate the idea of AI writing for them.
Right.
But they are comfortable outsourcing with the areas that they don't feel comfortable or love doing.
Okay.
On the other hand, it's kind of like if you were an artist who created black and white images or woodblock prints in a moment where the halftone printing process was really picking up, you would have to learn those new tools and adapt and change with them if you wanted to continue to work in that industry. So I try to be pro AI experimentation, but anti AI outsourcing critical skills in technique and thinking. So
Gotcha.
Try to use it as a tool, not a one-stop shop for all your hopes and dreams to be done very quickly.
Exactly. And if I can add to that, take that tool, walk into your backyard, dig a very deep hole, and throw the tool into the hole, fill the hole with dirt, step on it a couple of times, and then go back inside.
But how do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, it's for me. I'm in no AI, no exceptions. That's my position. To be fair to your students, I do see authors. If any authors are listening to this, you might want to pay a little bit of attention. Stop washing the dishes, and hear what I have to say. Using AI for their covers or for marketing imagery for, a book release or something, or they'll use it for maybe pieces of art that accompany their Substack or some kind of newsletter. I see authors fairly comfortably using AI to create imagery to support their writing. And they need to stop. And the reason is, would they feel comfortable if an illustrator took their writing and fed it through AI to create another piece of writing that the illustrator used to maybe sell? The answer obviously is no. So if they don't want that to happen, they should stop using AI to create art.
So the professionals are also doing I will use AI for the things that I am not comfortable doing myself.
So your students are ahead of the curve, it seems like.
Or spot on with it.
Yeah.
And I get that. But it's also, I think it's doing a disservice to the other creative people and an adjacent industry that you could figure out how to work with so that you support one another. And it's also opening yourself up to tricky things down the road. Like you can't copyright anything that you use AI to generate. So somebody else can copy that book cover with no recourse.
Oh my gosh. Skylar, you are a mind reader, because here's a nut I don't think has been cracked yet. Little caveat, obviously, I'm not tapped into literally every conversation being had across the universe here, but I haven't seen this. How will images made using generative AI be appraised years from now? How will it be credited?
See, that's still a nut I'm trying to work out myself. My best guess is, again, it depends on what the item is being appraised for. Not that it changes the value. The value is the value. But you're going to have to rely on comparables. It complicates issues of provenance unless they're using other technologies along with AI, like blockchain, to claim it as theirs and to show transfer of ownership. But if somebody duplicates an AI image and uses it 10 times, which one's the original, who has ownership? It's a complicated knot that we're just kind of figuring out as we go, which there's a lot of precedent for that in history as well. Like the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people had to die before we figured out that we shouldn't put 8-year-olds in coal mines.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a while for legislation to put in the safe bars around things.
If someone uses generative AI to forge an image that was created using generative AI, is that still forgery?
I feel like that would involve a law degree that I do not possess. But it's a very valid question.
Yeah, because forgeries, the best forgeries, the forger? Why does that not sound right? The person doing the forgery has to use the same materials, or else it's obvious fake.
Yeah.
In the AI world, there are no materials. So is it still forgery?
That's a great question, because the way AI functions, or at least the way it's been explained to me when I asked for my 5th grade version,
it steals from art, and essentially it's basically like Google. It's searching through Google and then just copy and pasting into a mishmash of color and shape. That's what it's doing.
Well, it's using the same technology based around predictive text. So it's looking at pixels. If it's image generation or if it's word generation, it's saying, like, if you're asking for a sunset, this orange pixel, taking the average across all the things that it has scoured or pulled from, and saying this yellow pixel goes next to this orange pixel, which goes next to this red pixel. So in a way, it's like the most boring crowdsourced version of a sunset
Yes.
you've ever seen.
Yeah, it's like the lowest common denominator is what every generative AI piece is.
Yeah. And in some ways it raises a bar. Like, that's the new baseline that artists or creatives have to meet in order to prove themselves to be above AI. But it seems like a pretty easy bar to
that bar's on the ground. That doesn't bother me whatsoever. I just think, like, okay, so it's still a forgery. For me, again, it's something I just thought of. I have to think about this longer, but for me, I guess if the answer is yes, it is a forgery, then doesn't that help make the case that AI is theft? If the answer is no, it is not a forgery, then doesn't that devalue, because then it's just a copy?
I agree with both of those points. And it's part of a long history of figuring out what you can and can't do in regards to art. Like, I teach about Dürer and Raimondi. Are you familiar with this at all?
Vaguely. There was some sort of like copying. Yeah, tell us about it.
Raimondi would basically take Dürer's work hot off the press and copy it.
Yeah.
Hook, line, and sinker, and then sell it without giving any of his profits back to Dürer. And Dürer took him to court. And it's one of the first court cases around intellectual and visual property. And the court agreed that Raimondi shouldn't do that, but the only part of Dürer's art that could be protected was his signature, because that was unique to him. So it's interesting whenever you go into a museum and you'll see something that looks just like a Dürer, but there's just a random panel that's just completely blank. Raimondi didn't stop knocking off Dürer. He just stopped copying his signature. So it's a messy system. It's been messy for a long time, and I hate that that's the answer, but I think these are all good questions to ask and figure out solutions for as we move forward.
Or not. We don't have to solve this. We don't have to solve anything related to AI. Let it be a mess. Let it be just a terrible, knotted up, ugly mess.
I'm also not convinced, especially for image generation, that it's going to have staying power.
I agree.
Because for me, at some point, it's going to start feeding on AI images that it's already generated.
Exactly.
And keep getting worse.
Yep.
But I am very far from a technological scientist.
No, I'm with you on that one. Gosh, how do you transition from AI sucks and it's forgery or it's not to pieces of advice for illustrators? You know what? I'm just going to transition out, and that's fine. So we have illustrators listening who aren't using AI, right, people? What piece of advice or bit of insight or something that you've learned from history that you would like to share with them directly?
Always ask questions and be curious. Don't lose heart if you have to take part-time jobs or if you feel like you're taking a left turn because you need to pay bills. I like Seneca's quote that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Preparation comes in all shapes and sizes. So look to the past if you're curious on how to crack a situation, because there's probably been a similar thing that has happened or somebody has faced. And it's really easy for problems to feel big and like they only affect you. But they've been going on for a long time.
Skylar can be found on LinkedIn. If you find value in this podcast, consider supporting it via our best-selling Substack or Patreon. While each offer different benefits, both provide access to dozens of exclusive episodes we call Extra Credit. You can find links to both on our website or show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.